Hello, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Moving Through the Managed Services, Continuum to an Outsourced Infrastructure. My name is David Goodstein, and I'm a webinar coordinator for the Outsourcing Institute. It is our pleasure to be the co-host of today's event with AT&T. I'll be working in the background to help answer any technical or general questions that you may have. Before we begin today's session, I'd like to quickly tell you about the questions box you can use throughout today's session. We encourage you at any time to submit your questions to today's speaker. To do so, click on the questions box, type your question in the space provided, and click the submit button. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you'll be receiving a follow-up email tomorrow, which will include a link to today's recorded webinar and presentation slides. The webinar and presentation slides will also be available at outsourcing.com. Before we begin, I'd like to quickly tell you about the Outsourcing Institute for those who aren't familiar with us. The Outsourcing Institute is a professional association dedicated to providing independent best practices, tools, roadshow events, and networking opportunities for all forms of outsourcing. Located at outsourcing.com, we have 70,000 members globally. OI specializes in providing low-cost and no-cost alternatives for outsourcing buyers in need of RFP tools, vendor selection assistance, training, as well as general support and coaching. For those of you in this market, we offer an array of very targeted sponsorship and promotional opportunities. Our sister company, CMS, provides recruiting services for those seeking to hire outsourced professionals experienced at buying, selling, managing, or consulting in this arena. Contact information is at the bottom of the screen for those who have any questions. I'd also like to quickly tell you about a few events the Outsourcing Institute has coming up. We have our Sales Readiness Service Provider Summit Series. We will be having in Dallas on September 11th, and we'll also be having it in London on September 24th. We will also be having a BPO Innovations Conference in New York City on November 13th. So if anybody wants to check those out, please go to outsourcing.com/events. At this time, I'd like to now turn it over to our moderator for today, Tony Mataya, Principal at Avasant.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. We have an exciting topic and some great presenters today. I'm a principal of Avasant. Avasant is a sourcing advisory firm, and I'm a senior advisor with the Outsourcing Institute. And so today my role is to make sure we get as many of your questions answered and help to hopefully add some value to the event. My background is working in IT and sourcing space. I've been doing that for 25 years with IBM, TPI, and Pricewaterhouse, and starting my own firm, and then also with Avasant. So hopefully I'll be able to add a different perspective from the client, the advisor space, as well as the provider space. So I'm going to turn it over to Joe from AT&T.
Thank you, Tony. I appreciate it. My name is Joe Russell, and I'm with AT&T Network Sourcing and Integration Arm. I have 18 years experience in the enterprise business space, and particularly today support our most of world entity, our sales entity that is outside North America. And I'm here today with my boss and mentor, Maureen Moyer. Maureen?
Thanks, Joe. Hi, yes, my name is Maureen Moyer. I'm also with AT&T. I've been in the IT industry for also almost 20 years, for the last few years in the sourcing and integration space, and manage a team across our different channels, in both global, as Joe talked about, as well as our signature client, our premier, and our gem space. So learned a lot, doing a lot of work with our clients in sourcing and managed services, and hope that the discussion today will open up some good dialogue, some good questions, and that we might be able to help you in your quest to think about what it is you need to do at the right time for your own companies. I'll turn it back over to you, Joe, to move to the next.
All right. Thanks, Maureen. Excellent. So next slide, David. We can look at real quickly the agenda and topic flow today. We have a lot of information to share, and so we'll move relatively quickly through the overall grounding and descriptions that we have, because we're really looking forward to engaging in some question and answer with the audience as well. But from a topic and flow, we're going to talk about integration as a service, and I'm going to first define managed services versus infrastructure outsourcing, keeping in mind that when I say infrastructure or network sourcing, I'm not talking about an SI approach or a single throat to choke, but instead a specific multi-source or towered approach to the sourcing continuum. We'll talk about that managed service continuum in regards to network considerations, resources, tools, and platforms, and then we'll go a little further and discuss the operational structure. So when we share what we believe is the most important operating aspects of a service continuum, we'll define that through IT structure and governance, and we'll also cover outsourced elements and the challenges that partners have in delivering these. We'll get near the end, and I want to talk specifically about a couple of use cases. We have many to talk about, but these two particularly kind of play to what we lead up to. And then finally, we'll close with the benefits of an outsourced environment and its elements. Next slide. So let's start there. We're going to talk about managed services and beyond, and particularly, next slide, in particular defining managed services versus outsourcing. So a little bit of a grounding here, but in the managed service on the left, as you see, the managed service partners are going to provide full support within each service. So from a staffing perspective, the customer's staff is going to manage infrastructure. From an SLA perspective, they're obviously going to be independent and per service, and then from a process and support perspective, they're going to be per service as well. There's a lot of managed services that are adopted by companies today. They've become an extremely valuable element in delivering services. But the challenges that we see, for instance, Gartner today estimates that the average enterprise can be managing up to 14 service providers at any given time. This can obviously be expensive, and it's obviously complex. But on the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, we look at infrastructure outsourcing. And it has the ability to provide support across all scopes of services. So from a staffing perspective, the partner would provide people and tools to manage the infrastructure and allow the customer to either reduce or refocus its own IT staff towards internal or value-added work. From an SLA perspective, overall SLAs are provided for the scope of the network services, and then your partner would, in turn, provide ITIL-based processes for the entire scope of services versus individual managed services. So all done and said, the adding people and processes into the mix can yield service accountability. That can drive value, like addressing capacity, incidents and issues, financial issues, but it does so across all service lines. Next slide. Let's take a look at some of the basic transition models that we see in the environment today. The good old-fashioned my mess for less, right, your mess for less, is a walk-in and take over, and it's best used when no transformation of the current support model is desired or needed. The advantages in this case is it can support fast action, and it can also maintain project momentum. But there's a disadvantage as well. It doesn't change the current support paradigm. It introduces risk due to short time frames and knowledge transfer. On the other hand, we see stage migrations, and they seem to be best used when the environment has to maintain network support or contractual separation for whatever the business reason. The advantage is that business units or maybe geographically focused units can immediately transform support processes and tools, but at the same time, the disadvantage there is that can introduce end-user confusion. For example, who's supporting me today? Can also delay cost savings. From a flash migration standpoint, they're best used when the environment requires any common cross-functional support model and tools. So interdependencies are critical here. The advantage being fast move to new support processes and tools, and they can clear control through transition. And then the obvious disadvantage is the need for preparation of systems inventory, loading of data. It can cause concern about mass support changes. And then my favorite, and one that we experience a great deal, is change via transformation. And this is best used when the environment has multiple suppliers, in which most of our enterprise customers and businesses do today. And they're going to have contracts with disparate contract dates, termination dates. So the advantage being there is change can occur as contracts expire and sites would migrate, and that's going to minimize contract termination cost and be effective in that manner. But the disadvantages is generally this can take a longer time to implement, right? So you've got disparate cross-functional support while that's happening, and you're going to be utilizing different tools during transition. So all said, there's no single easy answer here. Obviously, costs can be offset in savings, but it has to be weighed in a case-by-case basis by the customer. So many of you are in the audience are consultants and customers that need to weigh these advantages and disadvantages, and we can be of help, and all of you are oftentimes a help in doing so. So,
hey, Joe,
go ahead.
A couple questions. One is do you see in clients where you might have a case where it might be kind of a hybrid, where part of it might be a little bit of, walk-in, take over one aspect, but then there's another area that might require some transformation? So is it sometimes a combination of those?
Yeah, good question, Tony. I'm sorry I didn't mention that, because oftentimes it is just that, right? So that there's portions of legacy equipment and whatnot that need transformation, and there's other parts that are ready for handover. And, it's rare, if ever, that someone says, here, take it, it's all yours all at once. So to your point, yeah, it's oftentimes a mix of these elements.
If a client is in a position where they're, maybe they've been in under some financial constraints, and so maybe the infrastructure in some areas is getting aged, and they want to do kind of a full refresh, is that something that can also be factored into the approach you use and how you go about it and take advantage of that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the advantages we have at AT&T is that our partner network, third-party partners and relationships with your example, for instance, in the premise equipment space is powerful, right? So our buying discounts, our capability to refresh and construct an engagement to do that on a global basis is extremely strong.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, great question. Next slide. So I shared some basics, but there's a lot behind it, right? So I mentioned this ability to support and tie these elements together. I'm going to hand over to Maureen, who's going to speak about first the service continuum, and then drill down a little bit on our ITEL principles that we support, and then close her piece with a talk on the operational continuum and how we execute. Maureen?
Thanks, Joe. All right, let's move to the next slide. So Joe just talked about, the different models that we see, and as Tony, you point out, quite often customers have, our clients that we work with have, reasons that they need to do certain things in different ways, right? Some of them, it is something that they just want to manage, and it's managed to at end of life as they're working through a transition or transformation. So when we look at, infrastructure outsourcing, we see it as sort of a continuum. So if you look down at the bottom left, that managed wide area network, so sometimes that's the most rudimentary level of support that we're looking at, right? So it's manage my wide area, could be also manage my LAN. And when you're talking about that, that's a relationship where the client or the supplier has a responsibility for, monitoring, optimization, break fix. But as you work through and up and to the right of the stack, what you're going to see is that there is a change in responsibility, a change in complexity, certainly, change in demarcation of what is being managed in-house by a retained staff and what is being taken over by the supplier. And we see a shift in that, because there's just a lot of reasons why, IT organizations turn to third parties. And as Joe mentioned with Gartner, sometimes many third parties, and then sometimes it gets a little out of control. So as you're thinking about what things you want to perhaps outsource, also at the same time think about why you want to do that. So could it be, a lot of times we see that's around cost reduction, right? That's most often the first thing we hear. But increasingly, we're starting to hear other issues around being able to retain skilled labor, right? Spending a lot of time training and then trying to maintain your labor, and if it's not in your core business. And then there are things that you do want to work that are in your core competency or in your core business, and you want to be able to free up resources to be able to work on those strategic, sometimes revenue generating opportunities, and basically want to get out of the running of the network. So as you're working, and we'll talk about this as we move forward, but as you're thinking about what you might want to outsource, you want to think about the reasons why, and then what things you want to retain and what things that you want to be able to maintain. So, think about an example of this is, as you move towards unified communication. There's a lot of responsibility across, your different organizations, voice and data. Network security, as you're thinking about moving to the cloud. There's a lot of considerations there, and there's a lot of regulatory issues. So you have to think about what it is you're outsourcing and why. So, up in the top right, The basic difference here is that, it starts to have those multiple towers, across your organization. And, more functional responsibility and risk is moved to a third party. So you want to be able to think about what it is from a, individual tower to managing across a holistic system, as it were, and, the reasons and the time frames that you want to do that. So let's move to the next slide. So, let's think about the how, right? So we just talked about the sort of the what. This is really about the responsibility or risk from a how perspective. So we see this as, you could be managing through ITIL, the Information Technology Infrastructure Library, or maybe you're using ISO. And by the way, you don't have to be fully ITIL, compliant or have done everything from a process perspective through ITIL to be able to outsource. That's certainly not the case. But, think about how it is that you are managing. And, one way for you to think about that is the functions. So, I think that, even if it's ITIL, if it's ISO, or something else, something homegrown, I think these are really these 4 areas, what we find most often. These are kind of where we see the different best practices being managed. So think about how you want to do that. So up in the top right-hand corner, the green here, this third-party supplier management is usually working some of these. And it's, basically keeping the lights green. So that's, all the way from incident management, problem and event management, and capacity management, which you could be thinking about, kind of right-sizing the network, so you have some optimal performance. A little farther down, moving towards the left, think about, asset and inventory and invoice management. Here we also think about, billing integrity and contract compliance. Farther to the left there, modifying the service, so that's all about, how does the network change, and, who manages that change management, what project management might be involved in having to do that change management or request management. And then on the top left, you're going to hear me talking a lot today about governance. I believe that it is the most important thing when you're thinking about outsourcing. You want to make sure that whoever you're working with has a really disciplined approach about how the system is designed. How well are you going to work together? What are the expectations? Are they being met? If they're not being met, what happens next, right? You want to be very clear about this, and you want to be very clear from a governance perspective that what happens if, in fact, things aren't being met.
Maureen,
right, let's move
this is Tony. I have a question for you. You mentioned that clients don't have to be fully ITIL implemented or, at some platform to enable this process of different aspects of sourcing. But can outsourcing itself, or going through this process and utilizing, say, tools from maybe some of the tools you guys have, or CMDB and things like that you've got experience with, can it help to jumpstart or transform them to an ITIL environment quicker?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that, through the process and thinking about how you do things, and, just the discipline of maybe that's the way you've done it before, but is that really the way it should be done? And, as you're working through who's going to do what to whom and how you're going to work together, I think just going through those guidelines and that, the process by which you make those choices, then you take the time to think about it. That's when you become much more compliant, right? And things that, I mean, a lot of us have, our companies have grown, through a lot of different ways, mergers and acquisitions, and, very quickly sometimes, or we have some things that, hey, they worked, let's not worry about it. Susie's got that thing under her desk and she takes care of that, and, well, what happens if Susie leaves? So I think you're absolutely right, Tony. I think that, this is a great opportunity to do that sort of discipline and think about what your methods and procedures are. All right, let's move to the next. So earlier we talked about the continuum of managed services, right? Here we're looking at the functions and viewing them in sort of a continuum of the operating model, as it were. So Joe mentioned down on the bottom left-hand corner, your mess for less, right? Quite often that's, many of you are familiar with it. We're certainly familiar with it. Our other suppliers like us and integrators, they're familiar with it, and there is a time and a place for, walk-in, takeover, and, kind of your mess for less, as we have here. Typically, we see organizations pursuing this strategy because they're not really, or either short-term, they're not looking at transformation. They're sort of overwhelmed with, the need for a stable environment. Maybe they have a complex or, a hodgepodge environment and, as I said earlier, developed over time, maybe during M&A or other things, and they're really looking to sort of, get it locked down. They're looking to minimize costs. Sometimes they're looking to redirect capital. So a lot of times this is where our conversations start. And also, as Tony asked and we pointed out earlier with Joe, is sometimes pieces of the organization stay there for a period of time until there is a transformation, right? But we certainly quite often start there. But we also are seeing a trend over time where, as you move up the continuum, we're starting to see organizations that are a little more, we have maturity on the right, and by maturity, we mean the way that a client is looking at how to structure their business on a go-forward basis, their infrastructure for their business on a go-forward basis. We are seeing more often that customers are looking to, benchmark against the competition, against their own competition, understanding what it is that their own competitors are doing and how they're doing it in order to, minimize those internal costs and be able to take the advantage and use those capital resources elsewhere. So they're starting to look to innovate. They want to utilize new technology. So hand in the hand with that, we see a change in the negotiation strategy, or again, the maturity of negotiating this kind of risk-sharing approach. So by risk-sharing, what I mean is, it's less of a, these are my, in an individual managed service landscape, you look at your SLAs, right, on an individual case-by-case basis, on a managed service by managed service basis. Here, it's more of where both companies have a vested interest in improving, and therefore there is a shared supplier risk, right, where both will do well if both do well. And by that I mean, if you're looking to the future, yes, there are absolutely things in the here and now that you have to make sure are working and that those SLAs are, this is all about improved performance, right? But when you think about your short and long-term goals, you definitely want a partner that's going to be open to that shared risk discussion,
hey, Maureen,
right? And yes.
Question, beyond that, we have a question from the audience. Beyond the contract, are there rules of engagement from a governance perspective that you can put in place or that should be put in place, and processes and things like that help to manage these type of arrangements and the type of maturity movement you're talking about when you move more towards that outsourcing end of the spectrum?
Yes, absolutely, and I know we have a slide particular to the different levels of governance. I told you I'm a little passionate about governance, but you're absolutely right. There are different levels that you'll want to make sure that it's part of the governance process, and that's when I tell you, who does what to whom, right? So from an operations perspective, from a service level management perspective, from an executive level, you'll want to make sure that all of those, that structure is in place. And that's through governance. And I can't stress it enough that you have to work with a partner who truly believes in governance and believes in, making sure that that all of that is worked out and how you work together on those different levels with folks that are of the same level as well, right? So that there's a power base on both sides to make sure that the right things are done. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks, Maureen. Can we talk? Can we maybe move forward and talk about, more about network integration and our managing services and?
Sure. Why don't we? Yeah. Why don't we jump ahead to Joe, to your slides where you start talking about the whole tenets of integration and sourcing.
Yeah,
one more slide, and then we'll pick up.
Yeah, one more slide. And that's an important point too, by the way, is AT&T, the way we're structured, our network integration and sourcing arm, We're formally different organizations, but we're melded together because of the obvious opportunity for AT&T, but the demand from our customers. Again, I had mentioned there's never a single answer or a one defined way to go about this, and our network integration arm brings together more third-party capabilities and things that we can do for customers, melding it into what hopefully eventually becomes a sourcing arrangement with a customer, but it allows us to actually manage this continuum. It really differentiates us from those who are specifically addressing specific issues for customers, or even further differentiates ourselves from the SIs out there. Next slide. What's the end game here? And we'll go, Tony, we'll also go back to that and quickly cover what the end game here is really taking managed services, or the ingredients which customers use to address each tower today, to ultimately a high-quality managed network. So, I'll state, I'm as an AT&T guy, right, I'm a big proponent of managed services, but managed services alone can limit the ability to capitalize on any of these efficiencies we're discussing. So for this slide here, each one of those colored spheres in the bottom represent a network tower, for instance, and each of the colored lines represent a part of the process for managing these towers. So when you have managed services, you have, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, you're going to have separate support structures, separate processes for each one of those towers. But as you move the continuum, you're able to migrate to a fully managed sourcing environment. Your structures and processes obviously have the ability to consolidate. So ultimately, you're going to have more efficient processes, better productivity, and cost reduction is seen through there. We'll also show in a slide that will define each one of these roles and responsibilities and how that actually works coming up. Next slide. I'm going to stay high level for one more slide here, just so we can actually share an example of an outsourced or network sourced infrastructure opportunity. Here we see various elements that could make up, and you could exchange these different managed services and capabilities, but here's a demonstration of one. All of them, you'll note, are reporting towards the service director role, who would be responsible for managing the service layer. The important part here is to support that layer, you're going to need scale and scope and skills and really the ability to integrate. And while this may seem obvious, it's actually very difficult stuff to pull off. And not just pull it off, but to maintain it and keep abreast of technology going forward and stay current with it. So if your customer or you as an organization and enterprise have it, that's fantastic. The good news is if you don't, you can get it. And so finally, to see the benefits that are listed on the right-hand side, and most of us want those, you have a requirement today to operate and optimize and transform and continuously innovate a network. And you'll need these skill sets in place to actually do that. Next slide.
Hey, Joe, another question from the audience that I think might be good to talk about here is, let's say that, as this network and this infrastructure gets more complex, but you're really trying to understand how that changes and evolves and affects your application. So if I've got a new application area, or I want to do some modeling to see what would be the effect of implementing a new application on there, is it something that then, as you see from the skill area or the integration aspect, that service director would then either bring that to the table or work with a third party who can focus on that to help answer questions about, how does that application impact the overall ecosystem?
Right. That's an excellent example, right, and one that's more and more, that's happening more and more with customers today. So left in a managed service environment only, you'd be left to your own devices, right, and figuring that out in trying to communicate with multiple providers, but the service level role is one that can coordinate, right? So through the governance process and the service delivery process, the service director serves as a single point of contact for a customer to have these very discussions, right? It can be about applications. It could be about an acquisition or a new location a customer is going to address. But having that service director role who's able to pivot between these services and have the intimate knowledge to what's going to happen, create a testing environment, price things out, all the various things that need to be done to figure this out is in place to do so. So that is particularly one of the key advantages of having a fully outsourced environment.
Okay, thanks, Joe.
Next slide. Let's talk, Maureen's passionate about this, so this is a chance for us to quickly move through and look at the actual structure and governance. I guess that's a good pivot point for us here. Maureen?
Okay, next slide. Thanks, Joe. So yes, you've heard me talk several times about governance, and as Joe says, they all know I'm very passionate about it. I think that governance it means different things to different people, but I think at its core, it's the process to ensure that an outsourcing relationship delivers on the goals outlined, right? The goals agreed to, they could be outlined in the contract, they're agreed to in the what and how, and it spells out the steps to be taken if it's not, which is just as important, right? So as we talked about before, best of breed suppliers, excel at governance. It's just something that you need to be really anal about, right? You have to really have a top decision criteria when you're selecting a partner. I personally think it's the most important thing. And as we talked about earlier, there are different levels of governance, right? So you need to make sure that you have all of those spelled out. As I said before, having the right level of people on each, and the plan that's well documented, it's mutually agreed upon, especially when you have a number of third parties. So not every outsourcer, any integrator, not any one individual, even just in the infrastructure outsourcing space, does everything well. So you want to make sure, too, that you have the best of breed third-party suppliers, and how do they work together, right? Because the whole idea here is that you're focusing on business improvement. At the end of the day, you want to have cost efficiencies, you want to have increased productivity, you want standardization that also drives cost efficiencies, and you want the best of breed of the services across, right? All right, so on the next slide, how do you do this, right? So this is just an example, thinking about, we talked about, a global service director in the slide that Joe was going through. But what you'll want to think about is, that you have a structure that makes it ensure that you have some sort of single point of accountability, because down below there, excuse me, if you're looking at the blue are the dedicated resources, and then the orange would be, and this is just an example of what would be designated or shared responsibilities. Because as you're working through, you're going to need different things at different times for different reasons, and you want to make sure that that structure is all outlined. So, you'll recognize across the 4 boxes, things we talked about before, those 4 bubbles, right, 4 areas. This is how the service management team would be organized around those things, because they're core competencies. And then below that, you'll have more resources with a good partner that are there. Some of them are, third party. Some of them aren't fully. The reason they're not, that they're designated and that they're shared is because you want to make sure that you have them when you need them. So, for example, project management, you might have something, along the transition or transformation. So you'll want to make sure that you can engage them there. And vendor management, when you have third parties, you want to make sure that they have a good amount of expertise. All right. Let's jump to the next slide. So this view represents kind of the client overall ecosystem view, right? So the blue, again, are those things that you'll want to retain ownership of. And, the orange, again, this is this is an example, so you may have different ways that you'd look at it for yourself. But one of the things that, I'd strongly recommend, and I think that you'll probably see in a lot of, external, folks that would tell their consultants and such that would tell you the same thing, you want to retain your strategy. You want to retain your strategy, your overall architecture strategy, your policies, and then you want to work, again, through the governance process on how you manage the rest, right? And some of these, we have everything down here in this view in orange. You might not want to outsource everything. You might not want to outsource everything in the very beginning. You might want to dip your toe in and try things out, as Joe talked about earlier. There may be things you'll never want to give up. So if you look at that second to last box on the left there, app development, and then management and data center, right, and IC Cloud in there as well. You may never want to give up your app development. You want to keep that real close to yourself. Or maybe you're using a third party and you would like the overall management being taken over, or managed through an overall infrastructure discussion. The big thing is you want to think about what it is that you want to. Service desk. You may want a niche player who works really well with service desk or desktop services. There are different, different companies that do, here at AT&T, we think that, from an infrastructure and network perspective, that's really our core competency. So we'll work with third parties who are best in their breed to bring then a full holistic solution to a customer. So you want to think about how it is that you manage this, and then how you do across the path of outsourcing, and what's part of your ecosystem.
Maureen,
Joe is going to, yes.
A quick question on the, retaining the strategy, architecture, and policy. If, say, you've outsourced the rest of these boxes and to maybe one or more vendors, but yet you require input on those different areas and technology into your decisions on strategy, architecture, and policy, then can you talk a little bit about how you would work with the supplier, or what's the supplier role in supporting that retained responsibility of the architecture, policy, strategy type roles?
You're absolutely right? Because, especially from a transformational perspective, and, you want to work with leaders in the industry who can tell you where they think you should go, right? What is the strategy I should adopt? But from a corporate perspective, you have your own corporate strategies. That could be something that, you want to expand throughout the most of world. Right? That could be your corporate strategy. So then it's the job and the discussion between, what your strategy is and what your, outsourcing partner is. What's the strategy then for the pieces of the infrastructure, in this case, that you're going to implement in an outsourced environment that would help you meet those goals in that strategy? There's a lot of different things. There's some companies that really want to get closer to their end user customer, and that's all about, using social media or, application development. So it's all about, through that governance discussion is what are the goals that you have, from a corporate perspective to take your company to the next level, and then how can your partner facilitate from what they do well, facilitate that strategy. Does that answer your question, Tony?
Yes, it does.
Okay, great. Okay, let's move to the next. Okay, so, as we talked about earlier, and Joe mentioned the Gartner, was 14, 13, 14, I think the number was 14. Many customers have at least that many, if not more, third-party suppliers that they're trying to work. There is a trend towards vendor consolidation, while at the same time, those big outsourcing agreements are also not, that's not a trend, right? So it's sort of this meeting in the middle of how do you choose a partner that can provide what's best of breed that they do themselves, and then one that is also really strong in managing other companies, right, for you, so you're not managing them all yourself, and utilizing that best of breed. So, from a transport perspective, we see, in the U.S. we see a lot of dual carrier strategies. In most of the world, even more so, right? Multiple carriers. It's very time consuming, and it can be very, very difficult and draining for a company. So make sure you choose a partner who can work with others, that has a lot of experience in working with others, both from, access here and abroad, the different types of access, all of that third-party management. From a technology perspective, you'll want to make sure that you have companies that, that have everything that you need, that have the relationships for everything that you need. So, the ones that come to mind right away are, like Cisco, Avaya. You want to choose somebody who is, for whatever it is that you're doing, has those relationships, right? And not only just a, vendor-to-vendor relationship, but that has a deep relationship with those partners that are important to you, because, you want to get ahead of that curve, right? Working with them ahead of time to make sure that the direction that those partners that perhaps you have already put a lot of, financial, wherewithal into having them in your network, or, as one of your partners, that they're going to go to the future that you also want to go to, right? So having someone who, who is already very close to And then there are a lot of niche players, right? We know that there's a lot of, small software companies out there, small video companies, and, you want to have someone who also knows how to, manage the relationship. Could be something that you're just as is, and then, you can work for going forward. And then again, it's all about governance, right? So I'll just end it at that. It all comes down to governance, no matter how it is that you manage across these different players. All right, let's move to the next slide. So, okay, what does this mean at the end of the day, right? So the approach that you can take can be thought of, we think of it as sort of 3 phases, right? So we talked about what are the things that you might want to manage that you want to take over, right? It could be a walk-in takeover, something that maybe you manage just to end of life. You want to make sure that you, are able to integrate and operate and be able to get all the costs out of that as possible and be able to work through, being able to move that to what the next transformation phase is, right? You want someone who's going to be able to integrate for you. The next one is once you have a sound operational foundation, then you'll want to, shift your focus and start thinking about transforming, right? And these aren't, I made it just sound like it was step 1, step 2, step 3, right? It's not that. This is an ongoing. This is a, while you're at things that you're integrating and operating, you're already transforming. When there's things that you're transforming, you're already integrating, and you could be looking to, innovating. So, you want to have a partner that thinks about that, right? That's able to be, not a one and done, right? That's the biggest complaint that we hear from clients with some of, especially the larger outsourcing arrangements. It was a one and done. I got it in. Yeah, they managed it from day to day. Yeah, they managed my third parties. Yes, they were able to manage my bill. They were able to, get my costs down. But I still didn't feel like I had a partner that looked for innovation and that was bringing me innovation opportunities, understanding my business. So you really want to make sure that you have a partner that looks at that, right? So,
Maureen,
yeah.
in an environment, can customers be in a mode where part of their business is kind of in an operational excellence mode, driving down cost, whereas another aspect of the business, might be in the, really innovation and speed to market objectives?
Yeah.
How do you balance that, or how do you manage to that? Do you see that often with your clients?
We do. We actually do see that. And, it's sort of like, if you think about it, anyone who's in manufacturing, it's one of those, you have that life cycle of your products, right? And you've got some things that are in the cash cow, and at the same time, you're taking the money from that or the cost savings, and you're putting that towards innovation for your next big thing, right? Think about that the same way here. While there are things that you have gotten, you've gotten all the costs that you can out of, that you have streamlined those processes as much as they can be streamlined. But there's no change for those particular pieces. While at the same time, there are things that you're trying to innovate. So, think about the cloud, right? So there are things that you would never want to take from a security perspective, and at least not today, or you have to be very, very careful about how you put them on the cloud, right, and how you make that available. You can have things that you want to continue to operate in the fashion that you always have done, but then take things that are the future of your company, applications and all that new, social media and things that are going to be how you're going to capture your clients' interests. Those
so can we talk about some situations or examples that you guys might have
right
that were?
Joe. Yes, Joe. Let's get on with our use cases.
Yeah, great. Let's move ahead a couple slides. Okay, so I'm going to qualify this. I'm going to talk about real quickly 2 use cases, and what the objective here is obviously to demonstrate in the real world exactly what we've just spoke to with customers. These 2 use cases I'm going to describe are global multinationals, but I want to put a qualifier in there that while it's really been over the years the Fortune space that has invested in and utilized this mode of operation and this transition to managed services to sourcing, over those years it has also come down market. AT&T has the capability to serve medium-sized enterprises in this same manner, construct agreements and support them in the same manner, and even more recently we've been seeing government entities begin to play in this space. But I've only got time to utilize a couple, so I'll start with this one. This is a recent win by AT&T, but not a recent customer. So there's a point to this. This customer came about and objective was really via transformation, a global automotive equipment supplier with almost 100,000 employees in 34 countries. As you can imagine, an extremely complex environment. They were challenged by all the obvious growth, need for simplification, cost control, and the need to transform and update, as Tony had mentioned, from out of the gate, an old legacy infrastructure that needed change. So AT&T came in and really applied everything that we spoke to today. We architected a solution. We began the integration process, but then most importantly could propose a way to operate it going forward, taking all of these elements, tying them together with what we call our secret sauce, or the LCM layer here, in driving the benefits for the customer. A very important part, because everything comes down to money at one point or other, right? So it's always, as you noted in their challenges, cost control is one of them. So how do you control cost while adding elements in more the immediate versus the long-term savings? Well, in this case, as I mentioned, this customer is a long-term customer in limited capacity in the WAN area, in some LAN, and some Internet, but had a long relationship with AT&T and was investing more and more in our managed services. So when it came time, an important point for you consultants and customers on the phone today, when it came time to re-up contract, which they're a very happy customer, there was the obvious question of cost reduction and contract write-down. This customer, with partnership with AT&T, but with their consultancy group and the customer themselves, saw the opportunity to reinvest the cost savings from re-signing with AT&T to bring together these services and implement sourcing arrangements with us, of essentially reinvesting their capital and their savings here to drive what their objectives were and drive the benefits they were looking for. So very important thing, something we're seeing more and more of today, is customers, looking to expand the relationship but utilize and leverage what they're doing with us today to bring this about. Good example there. Next one.
Joe, in that case, that you had, benefits range from cost control and efficiency all the way to business velocity, which Maureen was talking about earlier. So.
Yeah, and with the way they were structured, much like this next one, with independent carriers around different providers in each different region of the world, velocity, while their customers were requiring it and they were needing it to beat competition, they didn't have the IT structure to be quick and nimble. They didn't have business velocity in that space, so we were able to help them with that. This one, very different in the approach of the relationship with the customer. This customer is a global provider of banking and financial services, lots of employees across 156 sites globally. So a relatively large customer here had those same needs for cost savings, cost control, but also efficiency and simplification. This customer was not only complex, but they were not cost effective in the sense that they had, we mentioned the Gartner study on how many service providers you can have. This customer had a minimum of 5 different service providers across each of the network towers. AT&T was a small part, was just one of those. So when this customer went to RFP and was looking for a solution like this, they had largely knew this was where they needed to land to be effective globally and cost effectively. AT&T was drawn in as part of the RFP process to support largely the WAN environment and some Internet services, etc. But we had the opportunity in answering this RFP as a sub in the RFP to draw out what our solution, our managed service solution, and ultimately our network sourcing solution looked like. And it didn't take long till this customer, where again we had limited reach with, moved us up to the top of the pack and ended up changing their strategy from an all-in SI approach to a multi-source environment in which AT&T became the lead across all of these listed global managed services, into which now down the road is actually expanding. So they achieved their benefits, but they did so by actually being nimble in the process, starting out, doing the investigation, and discovering AT&T's services continuum and leveraging that. And now, like I said, down the road, we're actually adding managed services from our portfolio into this and expanding. So a great deal of cost reduction will benefits of operational efficiency and simplified infrastructure for this customer.
So Joe, you know, can you guys talk a little bit about, so if I'm a customer and I don't know if I want to move to this environment, I don't know what the benefits are, I want to get a feel for that. Do you guys have some tools or some approaches that could help understand, you know, how to get a feel for what are the potential benefits before they move into a full?
We do, yeah, and I had mentioned, right, it all comes down to money. It's all ties around the financials, how this works, and the benefits from it. Next slide, please. We have the capability internally to do total cost of ownership analysis and ROI analysis with customers, in upfront engagements and consultancy engagements with AT&T, and Maureen will talk about those next on the next slide.
Great, thanks, Joe. Yeah, if we could forward. Excellent. Okay, so there's a couple different ways, and Tony, you make a good point, right? So we have a couple different ways that we've developed some tools and working with consultants to develop these that customers can dip their toe and then, you know, a little deeper dive. So this first one that we're looking at here, this is a base case tool. So this is when, you know, you want to have that kind of, you know, quick and dirty view. What is it that I'm going to be able to spend, right? What is, or I'm sorry, I'll save. And, you know, what is it going to cost me? What's going to be the you know, the payback period? So in this tool that we've developed, just by using some you know, information around, you know, headcount and locations and pieces of equipment and, you know, some very easy to answer, we can look at some volumetric data, right? And then we can come and you know, see, does it make sense then to go to the next one, right, to the next stage. So we've been using this for about a year, and we're really starting to see that, you know, some good pieces, good feedback on this. You know, we're looking at fully loaded costs. We're, just to give a couple pieces here, tied to labor and maintenance, right, for managing the various technology towers. We are not, at this point, looking at hardware or software or transport, right? So once we do that, and if we move to the next slide, and once we've established the base case, then and see, you know, that there's a positive number that we want to be able to work towards, then we work towards the to a more full-blown business case. So you know, we get buy-in. This is more of a, you know, rough order of magnitude of ROM business case. It looks at your or the client's in-house costs versus AT&T costs. So you know, it's crucial that we think about certain things like, you know, how much will the transition cost? What are the ongoing expenses of governance? What are the one-time costs, you know, such as severance? And what's nice about this tool, we worked with an external consultant to develop it. We've got some information that is loaded in the back end that, you know, looking at a customer's particular size and scope, right? Because you certainly don't want to spend, you know, you can evaluate till, you know, you're almost dead, right? So you want to be able to get what information you know. Sometimes we work with the CFO in the company and we get everything that we need. But sometimes, you know, we don't, and we have to be able to work within the amount of information the company has, that a customer has. But, you know, at the end of the day, you want to be able to look at what the final scope of work is, and then, you know, what is that going to do? Think about not every sourcing arrangement is going to reduce headcount, right? Think about the number of individuals that you have that are doing more than one task, and they're wearing more than one hat. So, you know, needless to say, I could spend another hour just talking about the financials, right? The other one probably about governance, but you want to make sure that you choose a partner that will take the time to work through this, right? I mean, this is a lesson that was, I have to tell you truthfully, was hard learned at AT&T. We developed these tools because we had to. We had customers that were especially coming to us, or that we were developing relationships where they had never sourced before. So if you're in that situation, you know, you want a partner that's going to work through it with you to determine, you know, how much time and effort do we put into this to know if this is a good thing to do, and then how do we do it, and then does it make financial sense? What's the payback period? All those things. What's the rate of return? What's the internal? What's the net present value? All of those things, you want to be able to look at the metrics and make sure that this is going to make sense to you. Okay, I know we're running so late, so I don't know. I'm going to hand it back to you, Joe, if you want to kind of wrap it up and bring us home.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Maureen. That was excellent. So we can wrap up with this. There's two things that I'd like to leave you with. Next slide, please. Really how AT&T can help customers innovate utilizing these techniques, and then ultimately what our value proposition is. So real quickly, we have the ability to use people and process and the tools that we've discussed today to help customers not only enhance productivity but improve the customer experience. And as we mentioned with Tony, the increase of business velocity is a big value add, and then ultimately the driving of the ongoing innovation with customers there. We bring a great deal to the table from our labs to our different investments and partners in the business that can drive innovation unlike that is industry leading. Next slide. Let's talk about what the value proposition is of network sourcing from an AT&T view. It's about economy, obviously. It's the reduction of total cost of ownership, and even just as importantly, the transfer of risk. It's also about simplicity. It's end-to-end management, and that is ultimately to lead to improved performance. And then comes our ability to harness transition and transformation, and that comes through experience. It comes through the use of our processes, and as Maureen talked about, the leveraging of our existing relationships. So ultimately here it's about evolution, right? You're looking for a partner who has the ability to build a roadmap, but not just build a roadmap, but manage that roadmap to the expectations going forward, being flexible in its execution on the roadmap as technology changes, and just ultimately be successful to drive the customer's benefits that they're looking for at the onset. Next slide. So there's a slide in here. I saw a question, will the deck be available? It will be. So there's some detail about AT&T network sourcing integration. And on the following slide here, there's some contact information. You'll see myself, Tom Catalano, who couldn't be here today, but represents our signature client group from a network sourcing and integration standpoint, and then Charlie Barker is here from our value marketing in AT&T. Feel free to reach out to any of us, would entertain any questions or like to assist anyone in anything they'd like to know further. With that, I'll turn it back to the moderator.
Okay, you know, Joe, Maureen, I really appreciate the information you covered. You covered a lot of information in a short period of time and answered all the questions. I would encourage the audience to, if you have additional questions, contact Joe and Maureen and their team, and you're welcome to contact me as well. But I think you will find that, especially today when you're dealing with, you know, no network seems to be simple these days, and with the globalization and the movement to the cloud, the network is really becoming business critical, and so it's taking on a new aspect with multiple vendors. It really needs to have you really need to have someone who you can work with to understand and work towards those benefits and implement that. And none of these things is easy to do. I'll tell you that now, but I'll tell you the benefits, as they were saying in the use cases, can be tremendous. So. And it's almost a necessity these days. So thank you guys very much for attending, and we appreciate it. And if you would like to find out about more, you can go to outsourcing.com. Thank you.